My son-in-law forced me to sell the house and threw me out into the rain. My own daughter threw a broken trash bag at my chest and shouted, "Take your trash and get out of here." But when I opened that bag later that night in a cheap motel room, I was truly amazed. Inside was a savings account with $700,000 and a note that left me shaking. What was written inside that note changed everything I thought I knew about my family. Before I continue this story of betrayal and sweet revenge, please subscribe to the channel if you believe that families should never turn their back on you. Let me know which city you are watching from in the comments below. I am Harold, 75 years old, and until 10 minutes ago, I was a respected man in this neighborhood. Now I am lying face down in the mud. A bolt of lightning tore through the sky, illuminating the driveway of the colonial house I designed with my own hands 40 years ago. The thunder rattled the windows, but it was not loud enough to drown out the sound of my collection of vintage jazz records shattering against the concrete. I tried to push myself up, my hands slipping in the wet dirt, but a polished Italian leather shoe pressed down hard on my shoulder, pinning me back into the muck. "Stay down, old man," Brett sneered. His voice was slurred thick with the expensive scotch I had been saving for my 50th wedding anniversary. Brett is my son-in-law, a 32-year-old venture capitalist who drives a Porsche he does not own and wears suits that cost more than my first car. He stood over me, not a drop of rain touching him, because he was standing under the portico I built. I remember pouring that concrete. I remember calculating the load-bearing capacity to ensure it could withstand the harshest Pennsylvania winters. I never calculated that it would one day shelter the man who would destroy me. You are pathetic. Harold? Brett laughed, kicking a framed photograph of my late wife, Catherine, into a puddle. Look at you. You are 75, you smell like mothballs, and you are taking up space. This house is valued at $1.2 million. It is an asset, and assets need to be liquidated. Emily agrees with me. You are just a liability now. Go find a state-run nursing home. I hear the food is edible if you have no teeth. Rage, hot and sharp, flared in my chest. I wanted to stand up. I wanted to tell him that without me, the foundation of this house would have cracked 10 years ago. I am a structural engineer. I built skyscrapers in Chicago. I know how things stand up and I know how to make them fall. But my hip, the one that has been bothering me since the construction accident in '98, seized up in the cold rain. I was helpless. Then the front door opened. My heart leaped. It was Emily. My little girl. My Emily, who used to sit on my lap while I sketched blueprints, asking me why buildings did not fall down. She would stop this. She had to stop this. She was wearing a silk robe, her face pale, her eyes rimmed with red. She stepped out onto the porch, flanked by two of Brett's friends who were grinning like hyenas. "Emily, please!" I gasped, reaching a muddy hand toward her. Tell him this is my home. We signed the papers so you could optimize the taxes, remember? You promised me." Emily looked at me. For a second, I saw a flicker of something in her eyes. Was it fear? Was it sorrow? But then her face hardened into a mask of pure ice. It was a look I had never seen on her before. She did not reach for my hand. Instead, she turned around and walked back into the garage. My heart sank. Was she calling the police? Was she getting a blanket? She returned, dragging a heavy black, hefty trash bag. It was taped up clumsily with silver duct tape, bulging and misshapen. She dragged it across the porch, the plastic tearing slightly on the rough brick. "Get out!" she screamed. Her voice cracked high and shrill, echoing through the quiet cul-de-sac. "I do not want you here. You are ruining our lives. You and your old junk, Emily. What are you doing?" I whispered, the rain mixing with the tears. I could no longer hold back. "Take it," she yelled, and with a strength I did not know she possessed, she heaved the bag off the porch. It sailed through the air and slammed into my chest with a dull, heavy thud. It knocked the wind out of me, It felt like a bag of bricks. "You are trash, Harold," Emily shouted, her finger pointing at the street. "This is all you are worth. Take your trash and get out before Brett calls the cops and has you arrested for trespassing." Brett wrapped his arm around Emily's waist, pulling her close and kissing her on the cheek. "That is my girl," he smirked at me. "See, even your daughter knows you are expired goods. Now beat it, Boomer," before I let the dogs out. The heavy oak door, which I had sanded and stained myself 3 decades ago, slammed shut. The sound was final, like a coffin lid closing. I was alone, just an old man in the mud surrounded by broken records and soaked clothes, clutching a garbage bag. I slowly pulled myself up. My knees were shaking, not from the cold, but from a humiliation so deep it felt like my bones were dissolving. I looked at the house one last time. I looked at the roofline pitched at exactly 45 degrees to shed snow. I looked at the brickwork laid in a Flemish bond pattern for extra stability. Every inch of that structure contained my sweat and my love. And now it contained my enemies. I saw the curtains twitch in the house next door. Mrs. Higgins was watching. Of course she was. By tomorrow morning, the entire homeowner association would know that Harold Sullivan had been thrown out like a stray dog. I could not bear the thought of their pity. I had to leave. Now. I grabbed the neck of the trash bag. I expected it to be light, filled with my old sweaters or maybe just actual garbage. But as I lifted it, I groaned. It was incredibly heavy. It dug into my shoulder as I swung it up. What on earth had she put in here? My engineering textbooks, my collection of hammers. It felt dense, solid. I began to walk. The rain was coming down harder now, a freezing sheet of water that soaked through my thin jacket. I limped down the driveway past the mailbox I had installed when Emily was born and onto the dark asphalt of the street. I did not look back. I could not. If I looked back, I might have done something reckless like pick up a brick and throw it through the bay window. And I knew Brett. He was likely watching on the security cameras, phone in hand, waiting for an excuse to call the police and ruin what little dignity I had left. I walked for a mile to the bus stop on the main road. My hip was screaming in agony. The bag felt heavier, with every step a physical reminder of my daughter's rejection. Every car that passed splashed water onto me, their headlights blinding my tired eyes. I felt like a ghost haunting a world that had moved on without me. When I finally reached the bus shelter, I collapsed onto the metal bench. I was shivering uncontrollably. I looked at the bag sitting next to me. The duct tape was peeling in the wet. I hated it. I hated what it represented. It was a symbol of my failure as a father. I raised a child who grew up to throw me into the mud. A garbage truck was rumbling down the street, its mechanical arms slamming dumpsters into its compactor. The noise was deafening. An idea formed in my mind. Why carry this burden? Why carry the shame? I should just toss it. Throw the bag into the nearest dumpster and get on the bus with nothing but the clothes on my back. Start over. Or maybe just give up. I stood up, grabbing the bag with both hands, intending to heave it into the concrete trash bin next to the shelter. I swung it back, ready to let go. But as the weight shifted, I felt something hard and rectangular shift inside against my ribs. It felt like metal and paper, lots of paper. I paused. My engineer's brain, usually so logical, was firing off warnings. Clothes do not shift like that. Books do not feel like that. This weight distribution was wrong. It was too dense to be household junk. I lowered the bag back to the bench. I looked around. The street was empty except for the taillights of the garbage truck disappearing into the fog. My hands were shaking as I reached for the loose end of the duct tape. I told myself I just wanted to see what piece of my life she had decided to mock me with. Maybe it was my wife's jewelry box smashed to pieces. Maybe it was my old blueprints torn to shreds. I ripped the tape. The plastic gave way. I reached inside, bracing myself for more heartbreak, expecting to touch broken glass or soiled clothes. Instead, my cold fingers brushed against cold, hard steel. I pulled the object up so the street lamp could illuminate it. It was not trash. It was my wife Catherine's old metal biscuit tin, the one she used to keep in the back of the pantry. But the lid was taped shut with fresh tape, and underneath it, wrapped in plastic, was a thick, leather-bound book. My breath caught in my throat. I knew this book. It was not mine. It was Brett's. It was the ledger he kept locked in his safe, the one he claimed contained his sensitive client lists. Why would Emily throw this at me, and why was the biscuit tin so incredibly heavy? I sat there in the rain, the bus approaching in the distance, and for the first time that night, I stopped feeling like a victim. The weight in my hands was not trash. It was a message. I just did not know yet that it was a weapon. The neon sign of the Motel 6 flickered outside my window, casting a rhythmic, sickly red light across the cheap bedspread. The room smelled of stale tobacco and industrial cleaner, a scent that stuck to the back of my throat. I sat on the edge of the sagging mattress, staring at the gray carpet. I was 75 years old. I had a master's degree in structural engineering. I had helped design the skyline of Chicago, and now I was sitting in a $50 room off Interstate 95, shivering in wet clothes, with nothing to my name but a garbage bag. I stood up and shuffled to the bathroom. The fluorescent light buzzed overhead as I looked in the mirror. The man staring back at me looked like a stranger. His skin was gray, his eyes were hollow and rimmed with red, and mud was drying on his cheek. For a moment, a dark thought crossed my mind. Maybe Brett was right. Maybe I was just expired goods, a liability. I looked at the small bottle of sleeping pills in my jacket pocket. It would be so easy. I could just take them all, lie down, and let the cold rain of this terrible night be the last thing I ever felt. Why fight? My wife Catherine was gone. My daughter hated me. My house was gone. There was no foundation left to build on. But then my eyes drifted back to the main room. The black hefty bag sat on the floor where I had dropped it. It slumped there, heavy and silent. The curiosity that had sparked at the bus stop returned, cutting through my despair. Why was it so heavy? If Emily wanted to humiliate me, she could have just thrown my clothes. Why pack a bag that weighed 50 pounds? I walked back to the bed and hoisted the bag onto the mattress. I reached into my pocket and pulled out my small pocket knife, the one I used to sharpen my drafting pencils. My hands were trembling, but I sliced through the silver duct tape. I pulled the plastic flaps apart. At first, I felt a fresh wave of shame. The top layer was indeed garbage. There were empty soda cans, coffee grounds, and old newspapers. My heart sank. Was this the final insult? Did she weigh it down with trash just to make me carry my own indignity? I reached in to grab a handful of the refuse, intending to throw it across the room in anger. But my hand hit something solid underneath the layer of coffee grounds. I pushed the trash aside. My breath hitched. Beneath the camouflage of garbage was a metal box. I knew this box. It was a vintage tin with a picture of Queen Elizabeth on it. Catherine used to keep her sewing kit in it. It had been missing for years. I pulled the tin out. It was heavy. Dense. I set it on the bedside table. My heart was pounding against my ribs like a hammer. I pried the lid open. I did not scream. I did not gasp. I just froze. The world seemed to stop spinning. Inside the tin, neatly stacked in rows, were bundles of cash. $100 bills. Dozens of them. They were wrapped in vacuum-sealed plastic bags, the kind you use to store frozen meat. I picked up one bundle. It was thick. $10,000 at least. I counted the bundles. 1, 2, 10, 20, 50, 70. 70 bundles. $700,000. I sat back on the bed, the wind knocked out of me. This was impossible. Where did Emily get this kind of money? Brett gave her an allowance, sure, but he controlled every cent. He tracked her credit cards. He monitored the mileage on her car. This was cash. Untraceable, cold, hard cash. I looked back into the tin. Under the last stack of bills there was a white envelope. It was crumpled as if it had been folded and unfolded 100 times. On the front, in shaky handwriting, was a single word, Dad. My hands shook so hard I could barely tear the envelope open. I pulled out a sheet of notebook paper. It was stained. There was a smear of something reddish-brown on the corner. My stomach turned. It was dried blood. I began to read, and with every word the image of my ungrateful daughter shattered, replaced by something far more terrifying. Dad. The letter began. If you are reading this, you are safe, and I am so sorry. I had to scream at you. I had to throw you out. Please forgive me. I had no choice. I brought the paper closer to the light. Brett has gone crazy, Dad. He is not just an investor. He is running a Ponzi scheme with cryptocurrency. He lost everything 3 months ago. The investors are not normal people. They are dangerous. Russian mobsters. They threatened to cut off my fingers if he did not pay them back by next Friday. I felt a cold chill run down my spine that had nothing to do with the damp room. He has bugs everywhere, the letter continued. He put microphones in the kitchen, the living room, even the lamps. He tracks my phone. He tracks yours. He was going to have you declared incompetent and put you in a state facility so he could sell the house immediately. He needs the money to flee to Mexico. He has fake passports ready. He was going to leave you there to rot. I touched the dried blood on the paper. He hit me yesterday when I tried to hide your engineering journals. That is where the blood came from. Do not worry about me. I have been skimming cash from his safe for 2 years, ever since I found out who he really was. I hid it in Mom's sewing tin. This is your money, Dad. It is enough to start over. Please take it and go. Go to Arizona. Go to Florida. Do not come back. He has a gun in the nightstand. If you try to come back, he will hurt you. The letter ended with a sentence that made my throat tighten. I love you, Dad. You built us a home, but I let a monster into it. I am trying to fix it. Just save yourself. Love, M. I lowered the letter. Silence filled the motel room, but inside my head, there was a roaring noise. It was the sound of a sleeping giant waking up. For the last 5 years, I had been playing the role of the retired, gentle old man. I watered my garden. I listened to jazz. I let Brett talk down to me because I wanted peace for my daughter. I thought I was being a good father by stepping aside. But I had been wrong. I had not been peaceful. I had been passive. I looked at the money. $700,000. It was a lot of money. Enough to disappear. Enough to live out my days in a sunny condo in Boca Raton just like Emily wanted. But then I looked at the bloodstain on the paper. My daughter was in that house with a monster. A monster who hit her. A monster who planned to sell the home I built with my own hands to criminals. A monster who thought I was just a senile old man who would crawl into a hole and die. I stood up. The pain in my hip was still there, but I did not feel it anymore. I walked to the bathroom and splashed cold water on my face. I looked in the mirror again. The sad, defeated old man was gone. In his place was the man who had solved the structural crisis of the Millennium Tower in 1999. The man who knew how to calculate stress points, load distribution, and catastrophic failure. I walked back to the main room. I grabbed the only thing I had left in my jacket pocket besides the pills, my Rotring technical drafting pen. I walked over to the wall where a cheap paper calendar hung. I ripped it down and turned it over to the blank white side. I pinned the paper to the wall. I uncapped the pen. The black ink flowed smoothly. First I drew a square, the perimeter of my house. Then I drew the basement, the foundation, The hidden drainage valves I had installed 40 years ago, valves that were not on the official city blueprints. Then I wrote 3 names on the side of the paper. 1 Gus, my old chess partner who used to be a forensic auditor for the IRS before he retired. 2 Tompkins, the shadiest, smartest real estate lawyer I knew, who hated Brett more than I did. 3 Brett Sterling. I circled Brett's name. Then I drew a line through it. I am not going to Arizona. Emily, I whispered to the empty room. I looked at the stack of cash. That was not retirement money. That was a war chest. I picked up the motel phone. It was 2 in the morning. I dialed a number I had not called in a decade. It rang 4 times. A grumpy, gravelly voice answered. Yeah. Who is this Gus? I said, my voice steady and cold as steel. Wake up. I have a job for us, and you are going to want to bring your calculator. The game had changed. Brett thought he had thrown out the trash. He was about to find out that he had just woken up the architect of his destruction. I was going to bring his house down brick by brick. The rain outside the motel window had turned into a steady, rhythmic drumming, a sound that usually helped me sleep, but tonight it sounded like a countdown. I sat at the small, chipped laminate desk, the only light coming from a buzzing bedside lamp that cast long, yellow shadows across the room. In front of me lay the black leather ledger I had pulled from the bottom of the trash bag. It looked innocent enough, like a standard daily planner you could buy at any office supply store. But as I ran my hand over the cover, I knew I was touching the blueprints of a disaster. I put on my reading glasses, the ones with the taped arm that Emily always told me to replace, and opened the book. The first few pages were filled with gibberish, random strings of numbers and letters that made no sense. Most people would have seen chaos. They would have seen the scribbles of a madman or a bad gambler. But I am not most people. I spent 40 years looking at complex structural diagrams. I know that nothing in this world is truly random. Everything has a load path. Everything has a stress point. If you look hard enough, you can find the underlying logic that holds the structure together. I grabbed the motel stationery pad and my drafting pen. I started copying the sequences, looking for the pattern. It took me an hour of silence, broken only by the scratching of my pen and the pounding of my heart. Then I saw it. It was a simple substitution cipher based on the periodic table of elements. Brett thought he was clever, using chemical atomic numbers to hide financial figures. He didn't know his father-in-law had memorized the table in 1965. Once I cracked the code, the numbers stopped being abstract and started becoming terrifyingly real. I was looking at a dual-entry bookkeeping system, but it was unlike any legitimate accounting I had ever seen. On the left side were names. Not corporate names, but individual names. Margaret H. Robert T. Eleanor Vance. Beside each name was a date and an initial investment amount. $50,000. $100,000. These were not venture capital sharks. These were retirees, teachers, factory workers, people who had scraped together a nest egg to survive their twilight years. On the right side of the ledger were the returns, consistently high, impossibly stable, 12% monthly. In the world of engineering, if a column is too thin to support the weight of the roof, the building collapses. In the world of finance, if the returns are too high without any risk, it is a lie. I realized with a sick feeling in my gut that Brett was not just a bad investor. He was running a classic Ponzi scheme. He was taking money from new investors to pay off the old ones, skimming a fat percentage off the top to pay for his Porsche, his custom suits, and his expensive scotch. He was building a skyscraper on a foundation of quicksand. I turned the page and the structural integrity of his scheme completely failed. The dates from 3 months ago showed a massive hemorrhage. The cryptocurrency market had crashed. The new money stopped coming in. The sand had washed away. Brett was underwater. He was drowning, and he was dragging my daughter down with him. But that was not the worst part. I kept turning the pages, my fingers trembling with rage. I reached the entry dated just 2 weeks ago. There, in bold ink, was the address of my house. 42 Oakwood Drive, the house I built, the house where I raised Emily. Next to the address was a name that made the blood freeze in my veins. Valkov. I knew that name. Anyone who watched the news in this state knew that name. The Valkov brothers were not bankers. They were not investors. They were a Russian organized crime syndicate, disguised as a hard money lending firm. They did not sue you when you missed a payment. They broke your legs, or worse. The entry showed a loan of $1.5 million secured against the deed of my home. The interest rate was predatory, but it was the due date that made me stop breathing. The loan was a short-term bridge loan. It was due in full in exactly 7 days. I sat back in the creaky chair, staring at the wall. The picture was now complete. This was why Brett was so desperate to kick me out tonight. This was why he needed to sell the house immediately to that shell company. He wasn't just trying to get rid of an old man. He was trying to the asset to pay back the Russians before they came for his head. He had leveraged my life's work to save his own skin. My hand instinctively reached for the motel phone. I needed to call the police. I needed to call the FBI. This was grand larceny. This was fraud. I lifted the receiver, the dial tone humming in my ear, but then my eyes fell back on the ledger. Specifically, on a folded piece of paper glued to the back cover. It was a photocopy of the loan agreement with the Russians. I scanned the bottom of the page for the signature. I expected to see Brett's flamboyant, arrogant scrawl, but it wasn't there. The signature at the bottom, signed in blue ink, was Emily Sterling. I slammed the phone down. The receiver clattered against the base unit. That monster. That absolute coward. He had forged her signature. Or worse, he had coerced her, terrified her into signing it herself. If I went to the police now, Brett would claim he was just a victim of his wife's bad investments. He would say Emily was the one communicating with the Russians. The house was in her name. The signature was hers. The police would arrest her. The federal government would seize the house and the $700,000 as proceeds of a crime. Emily would go to prison, and I would be left homeless and daughterless. Brett had designed this trap perfectly. He had built a cage where the only way out was for him to win. If I did nothing, he sold the house and fled. If I called the cops, he framed Emily and fled. He had calculated every variable, but he had forgotten one variable. He had forgotten the engineer. I looked at the calendar on the wall where I had drawn my battle plan. I picked up my pen again. I looked at the 3 names I had written. Gus, Tompkins, Brett. I could not use the law. The law was a blunt instrument, a wrecking ball. If I used a wrecking ball, I would destroy the innocent people inside the building, along with the villain. I needed something precise. I needed a controlled demolition. I needed to cut the steel beams of his scheme one by one so that when it fell only on him. I needed Gus. Augustus Gus Miller was a man who legally did not exist anymore. We played chess in the park every Tuesday for 10 years. To the world, he was just another grumpy old man feeding pigeons. But I knew the truth. Before he retired, Gus was a forensic auditor for the IRS. He spent 30 years hunting down money launderers, tax evaders, and the kind of white-collar criminals who thought they were smarter than the system. Gus could look at a spreadsheet and tell you what the CEO had for breakfast the day he decided to embezzle. I looked at my watch. It was 3:15 in the morning. Gus would be asleep. He was a man of routine. But this could not wait. I pulled the burner phone from the bag of cash. I punched in the number from memory. It rang once, no, twice, no, 3 times. On the 4th ring, a groggy voice answered. Yeah. Gus, I said. My voice sounded different to my own ears. It wasn't the voice of the man who complained about his hip pain in the park. It was the voice of a man holding a detonator. Harry, is that you? You know it is 3 in the morning. Did you fall? Do you need an ambulance? I don't need an ambulance, Gus. I need a calculator, and I need your old badge. There was a silence on the other end of the line. Then the rustle of bed sheets. I could hear the shift in Gus's tone instantly. The sleep vanished. Talk to me, Harry. What is going on? I looked down at the ledger, at the name Valkov, at the millions of dollars stolen from innocent people, at the forged signature of my daughter. I found a structural fault, Gus. A big one. My son-in-law is building a tower of lies, and he trapped Emily inside. I have the blueprints. I have the money to fund the operation, and I have 7 days to bring the whole thing down before the Russians show up. I heard the sound of a lighter flicking on, followed by a long exhale of smoke. Gus was awake. Is it clean, Harry, or are we going to get our hands dirty? I looked at the mud still caked on my trousers. I looked at the bloodstain on Emily's note. It is filthy, Gus, but we are going to clean it up. Meet me at the diner on 4th Street in an hour. Bring the laptop, the one you use for the special projects. I hung up the phone. I stood up and walked to the window. The rain was stopping. The storm was passing, but a different kind of storm was about to begin. Brett thought he was the apex predator because he had youth and arrogance. He thought he could discard me like trash, but he made a fatal error in his calculations. He assumed that because I was old, I was weak. He assumed that because I was silent, I was stupid. I touched the cold glass of the window. You wanted to sell my house, Brett, I whispered to the dark horizon. I am going to make sure you pay for every single brick. I turned back to the room. I packed the ledger back into the bag. I put the cash in my jacket lining. I washed the mud off my face. When I walked out of that motel room door, I didn't limp. I marched. The engineer was going to work, and I had a demolition to schedule. The smell of burnt coffee and bacon grease at 4 in the morning is a scent that usually signals the end of a long night, but for me, it signaled the beginning of a war. I sat in the corner booth of the Silver Spoon, a 24-hour diner that sat under the highway overpass like a forgotten relic. The vinyl seats were cracked, and the table was sticky, but it was the only place in town where 3 ghosts could meet without being seen. I checked my watch. 4:15. The door chime jingled and a gust of cold air cut through the diner's stagnant warmth. In walked Gus. He looked older than I remembered. He was wearing a tracksuit that was 2 sizes too big and bedroom slippers. He had clearly sneaked out of the Shady Acres retirement home again. He shuffled toward me, clutching a laptop case like it was a nuclear football. Behind him came Tompkins. If Gus looked like a runaway grandfather, Tompkins looked like a tragedy. He used to wear $3,000 suits when he was the most feared real estate attorney in the state. Now stripped of his license for unethical conduct 5 years ago, he wore a polyester jacket that had seen better days and smelled faintly of gin. But his eyes were the same. Sharp. Predatory. The eyes of a man who knew where all the bodies were buried because he had dug half the holes himself. You look like hell, Harry Tompkins said, sliding into the booth opposite me. Gus grunted and sat next to him, immediately opening his laptop and plugging it into the wall outlet. I feel like hell, I replied. I did not waste time with pleasantries. I did not ask about Gus's grandchildren or Tompkins's liver. We did not have time. I reached into my jacket and pulled out 5 thick bundles of cash. $10,000 in each stack. $50,000 total. I dropped them onto the laminate table. The thud was heavy, satisfying. The waitress, a tired woman named Marge, who had been working here since the 80s, glanced over, saw the cash, and immediately looked away. She knew better. Tompkins sat up straighter. The cloud of gin seemed to evaporate from his demeanor. He looked at the money, then at me. Who do we have to kill? He asked, his voice low and serious. Nobody, I said, leaning forward. Not yet. I need to buy a ghost. I explained the situation. I told them about Brett, about the Ponzi scheme, about the house, about Emily trapped inside with a monster who was selling our lives to the Russian mob. I watched their faces change. They stopped being two washed-up old men in a diner. Gus started cracking his knuckles, a habit he had when he was auditing Fortune 500 companies. Tompkins pulled a notepad from his pocket, his hand steady for the first time since he walked in. "I need a shell company," I told Tompkins. "I need it to sound old, established, and incredibly wealthy. And I need a new identity. I need to be someone Brett will fear and respect. I need to be a shark." Tompkins nodded, already writing. "Pegasus," he muttered. "Pegasus Capital Holdings, incorporated in Delaware, headquartered in the Cayman Islands. I can backdate the registration documents through a contact I have in Dover. We can make it look like you have been managing billions since 1990. And the identity?" I asked. Tompkins looked me up and down. "We need to get you out of those engineer clothes, Harry. You look like you buy your pants at a hardware store. We will get you a suit, Italian, bespoke, silk blend, and we will change your hair. You are not Harold Sullivan, the retired builder, anymore. You are Arthur Vanderbilt, old money, ruthless, the kind of man who buys distressed assets for sport." I turned to Gus. He was already typing furiously, his eyes reflecting the scrolling code on his screen. "What do you have, Gus?" Gus did not look up. He was in the zone. "I am tracing the ledger entries you sent me. This kid Brett, he is sloppy. He thinks using crypto makes him invisible. He forgot that the blockchain is a public ledger. I am following the money trail from his wallet." He paused, hitting the enter key with a flourish. "He is bleeding out, Harry. He has less than $10,000 in liquid assets. He is desperate. That is why he is selling the house so fast. But here is the interesting part." Gus turned the laptop screen toward me. It showed a complex web of transactions, all funneling toward one digital wallet. "He owes money to a shell corporation called Red Bear LLC," Gus explained. I dug into Red Bear. "It is a front." "For who?" I asked. Gus looked grim. "The Valkov family." The table went silent. Even Tompkins stopped writing. The Valkovs were not just loan sharks. They were the kind of people who ran human trafficking rings and burned down businesses for insurance money. Tompkins whistled low. "Your son-in-law didn't just borrow money from a bank, Harry. He shook hands with the devil." Gus continued, his voice dropping to a whisper. "I am looking at the loan terms. It is a hard money loan. 1.5 million. Due in full in 48 hours. If he misses the deadline, the default clause kicks in." "What is the default clause?" I asked, dread pooling in my stomach. Gus pointed to a line of text on the screen. "Immediate transfer of the collateral property." And he squinted. "Harry, look at this addendum. All contents of the property are included in the transfer." I stared at the words. All contents. "Brett is selling the house furnished," Tompkins noted. "That is standard." "No," I said, my voice trembling. "You do not understand. Emily is in that house. She is practically a prisoner. If the Valkovs take possession of the house on Friday—" Gus finished the sentence for me. "They take everything inside, including her." My blood ran cold. This wasn't just about financial ruin anymore. This was about survival. Brett was going to hand the keys over to a Russian mob boss, and when they walked in and found my daughter there, God knows what they would do. They would use her. They would use her to get to the money she stole, or they would just dispose of her like a loose end. I slammed my hand on the table. "We have to move faster." Tompkins grabbed 2 bundles of cash. "I will have the papers ready by noon. I know a tailor in the garment district who owes me a favor. He will open early. We will make you look like a billionaire by lunch." Gus grabbed his share of the money. "I need to go deeper. I am going to hack into the title company Brett is using. If I can delay the official recording of the deed by even an hour, it gives us a window. But Harry, Gus looked at me, his eyes wide behind his thick glasses. The buyer. The one coming to the open house tomorrow. The one Brett thinks is a legitimate developer, yes. It is not a developer. Gus swallowed hard. It is Dmitry Valkov himself, the head of the snake. He is coming to inspect his new purchase. He wants to see the house before he takes it. My heart hammered against my ribs. Dmitry Valkov, the butcher of Brighton Beach. He was coming to my home, to walk on my floors, to look at my daughter. I stood up. The fear was gone, replaced by a cold, calculating rage. I was an engineer. I dealt with forces of nature. Gravity, wind, pressure. Dmitry Valkov was just another force, and every force could be countered if you had the right leverage. Get the papers, Tompkins, I commanded. Gus, find me everything on Valkov, his weaknesses, his ego, what he eats for breakfast. I buttoned my cheap jacket, knowing it was the last time I would wear it. Tomorrow Mr. Vanderbilt is going to make an offer, and if Valkov thinks he is taking my house, he is going to find out that some foundations are built on dynamite. We left the diner as the sun began to crack the horizon. 3 old men, 1 disgraced lawyer, 1 bored accountant, and 1 homeless engineer. The world had written us off. But as we walked into the morning light, I knew one thing for sure. We were the most dangerous thing in that city, because we had nothing left to lose. The windows of the rusted Ford Econoline van were tinted dark enough to hide a man, but not dark enough to hide the shame I felt sitting inside it. I had rented the vehicle 3 towns over using a fake ID Tompkins had procured, paying cash to a mechanic who did not ask questions. It smelled of old grease and stale fast food, a far cry from the leather seats of my sedan that was currently parked in the garage of my own home, inaccessible to me. But this van was not a vehicle today. It was a bunker. I was parked exactly 200 yards down the street from 42 Oakwood Drive. The angle was perfect. From here, through the pair of high-powered naval binoculars I had bought at a surplus store, I had a clear line of sight into the living room and the backyard of the house I had designed. It was strange to look at my life's work from a distance. The brickwork I had laid with such precision looked different from the outside. It looked like a fortress, and my daughter was the prisoner in the tower. I had been watching for 3 hours. My legs were cramping in the tight space, and the coffee I had bought at the diner had gone cold and bitter. But I did not move. I watched the shadows lengthen across the lawn. I watched the landscaping crew leave. I watched the delivery truck drop off crates of expensive champagne for the open house tomorrow. Every detail was data, and I was processing it all. Around 6 in the evening, the lights in the living room flickered on. The warm glow spilled out onto the front lawn, creating an illusion of domestic bliss. To anyone driving by, it looked like a perfect American home. But through the lenses of my binoculars, the truth was much sharper and much uglier. I saw Brett first. He was pacing back and forth, holding a phone to his ear. Even from this distance, I could see the tension in his shoulders. He was gesturing wildly. The deadline with the Russians was closing in, and I knew the pressure was eating him alive. He looked like a man walking a tightrope over a pit of vipers. Then Emily entered the frame. My heart squeezed in my chest. She looked so small. She was wearing a gray dress, carrying a silver tray with a decanter of wine and 2 glasses. She set it down on the coffee table. She said something to Brett. He ignored her, continuing to shout into his phone. She reached out, perhaps to touch his arm to calm him down. Brett spun around. His movement was violent and sudden. He knocked the phone away, and in the same motion, his hand struck out. He didn't just push her away. He slapped her. I saw her head snap back. I saw her stumble and fall onto the couch. The wine decanter tipped over, spilling a dark red stain across the white rug Catherine had loved so much. A roar filled my ears, drowning out the traffic on the main road. It was the sound of my own blood rushing to my head. I dropped the binoculars. My hand went for the door handle of the van. I was going to kill him. I was going to drive this rust bucket straight through the front door and tear him apart with my bare hands. I didn't care about the plan. I didn't care about the money. I was a father, and that was my baby girl being hurt by a coward. I had the door half open, one foot on the pavement, ready to sprint across the lawns. But then the crinkle of paper in my pocket stopped me. The letter. Emily's letter. "Do not use violence, Dad. He has a gun. He is waiting for an excuse. Use your head." I froze. I watched Brett through the open van door. He was standing over her now, pointing a finger in her face. If I ran in there now, what would happen? I was 75 years old with a bad hip. Brett was 32 and fueled by cocaine and desperation. He would shoot me, claim self-defense against a deranged intruder, and he would get away with it. Emily would be left alone with him, traumatized and defenseless. I slowly pulled my leg back into the van. I pulled the door shut. It was the hardest thing I have ever done in my life, to sit there and watch my child suffer and do nothing. I gripped the steering wheel so hard the leather cracked under my fingernails. My knuckles turned white, and then I felt a warm trickle of blood where my nails pierced the skin of my palm. I welcomed the pain. It focused me. I picked up the binoculars again. I forced myself to look away from the window. I could not watch her cry. I had to look for a way to save her, not just witness her pain. I shifted my gaze to the exterior of the house, scanning the perimeter, looking for a weakness. I looked at the backyard. Brett had done extensive renovations in the last 6 months. Renovations I had not paid attention to because I was trying to be the silent, supportive father-in-law. He had installed a massive infinity pool that stretched to the edge of the property line. It was gaudy and ostentatious, meant to impress his shallow friends. I adjusted the focus on the binoculars. I looked at the decking around the pool. It was seamless stone imported travertine. Very expensive, very heavy. And then I saw it. My breath caught in my throat. I lowered the binoculars and wiped the lenses, thinking I was seeing things. I looked again. When I built this house 40 years ago, the land had a natural slope towards the creek at the back. To prevent the basement from flooding during the heavy Pennsylvania springs, I had installed a redundant drainage system. It was a complex network of French drains leading to a primary emergency release valve located in the southwest corner of the yard. It was an ugly iron grate about 2 feet wide that looked like a manhole cover. It was essential. It was the lungs of the property, allowing the ground to breathe and release hydrostatic pressure when the water table rose. I scanned the southwest corner of the yard. The grate was gone. In its place was the pump housing for the new infinity pool and a slab of concrete that Brett had poured to create a patio area for his barbecue grill. I stared at the spot, my engineer brain working faster than a supercomputer. Brett, in his arrogance and vanity, had paved over the emergency relief valve. He had capped it. He probably told the contractors to just cover that ugly hole because it ruined the aesthetic of his pool deck. I looked up at the sky. The storm from last night had dumped 3 inches of rain. The ground was saturated. The water table was rising. Without that valve, the water accumulating under the foundation had nowhere to go. It was building up pressure against the basement walls. It was pushing up against the bottom of the new pool. I started to laugh. It was a dry, cold laugh that startled me. Brett had spent $200,000 on a pool to increase the value of the house. But he didn't understand physics. He didn't understand that water is incompressible. By sealing the ground, he had turned the soil beneath the house into a pressurized hydraulic chamber. The house wasn't just a building anymore. It was a balloon waiting to pop, and the pressure was already critical. All it needed was a little push, a small failure in the system, to cause a catastrophic chain reaction. I looked back at the window where Brett was still screaming at Emily. He thought he was powerful. He thought he controlled the situation. He had no idea that he was standing on top of a geyser. "You idiot," I whispered, a smile spreading across my face that felt sharp enough to cut glass. "You stupid, arrogant boy. You wanted an infinity pool, I am going to give you an ocean." I reached into my bag and pulled out the blueprints of the house at the ones I had drawn in 1980. I traced the line of the main water main that fed the house. It ran directly parallel to the now buried drainage valve. If I could manipulate the pressure in the intake pipe just enough to cause a vibration, the resulting hammer effect would meet the resistance of the saturated ground. The weakest point would give way. And the weakest point was now the valve he had sealed with concrete. I did not need a bomb. I did not need a gun. I just needed a wrench and access to the municipal water junction box at the street corner. I started the engine of the van. The rumble of the motor felt like the growl of a beast waking up. I took one last look at the house. "Hang in there, Emily," I said softly. "Daddy is going to fix the plumbing." I put the van in gear and drove away slowly. I wasn't running away this time. I was going to the hardware store. The reconnaissance was over. The demolition was about to begin. And tomorrow, at the open house, Brett Sterling was going to learn a very expensive lesson about fluid dynamics. The man staring back at me from the full-length mirror in the back room of the tailor shop was not Harold Sullivan. Harold Sullivan was a 75-year-old retiree who wore cardigans and bought his slacks at discount stores. Harold Sullivan had thinning gray hair and a posture that apologized for taking up space. The man in the mirror was a shark. His hair was dyed a sharp, aggressive jet black slicked back with expensive pomade. His jaw was freshly shaven, revealing a structure that had been hidden under a white beard for a decade. He stood tall, his shoulders squared in a midnight blue bespoke Italian suit that cost more than my first car. Tompkins stood behind me, adjusting the silk handkerchief in my breast pocket. He whistled low. "You look like you are about to hostilely take over a country, Harry. Or should I say, Mr. Vanderbilt." I adjusted the tinted aviator sunglasses. They were essential. They hid the crow's feet around my eyes, but more importantly, they hid the hate. If Brett looked into my eyes without them, he would see the father he betrayed. With them, he would only see his own reflection. "I feel ridiculous," I muttered, buttoning the jacket. It felt tight across the chest, reminding me of my army uniform from 50 years ago. "You look like money," Tompkins corrected. "And money is the only language Brett Sterling speaks. Now make the call." I took the burner phone from my pocket. My thumb hovered over the call button. This was the first structural test. If my voice cracked, if I sounded like a grandfather instead of a corporate raider, the whole plan would collapse before the foundation was even poured. I closed my eyes for a second. I visualized the steel beams of the Sears Tower. Cold, hard, unyielding. I channeled that coldness into my throat. I pressed call. It rang twice. "Hello," Brett's voice was breathless, agitated. I could hear traffic in the background. "Mr. Sterling," I barked. I did not ask, I stated. "This is Arthur Vanderbilt, Pegasus Capital. I am sitting in a private jet on my way to London, and I have exactly 2 minutes before takeoff. Do not waste them." There was a pause. The change in Brett's tone was immediate. The agitation vanished, replaced by a slippery, eager customer service voice. "Mr. Vanderbilt, of course. I received the inquiry from your legal team this morning. I am so glad you called personally." "Cut the pleasantries," I snapped, making my voice rougher, deeper. "My analysts tell me you are sitting on a property at 42 Oakwood Drive. They say it is undervalued. I say it is a mess. But I need a tax write-off for this quarter, and I like the neighborhood." "It is a stunning property," Sir Brett stammered. "A true gem. We have done extensive renovations. Infinity pool. Open concept. It is turnkey ready." I laughed. It was a harsh, dismissive sound. Every real estate agent says their dump is a gem. I don't care about your pool. I care about the closing speed. I hear you are distressed. I hear you need cash. I am not. We are not distressed, Brett lied, his voice climbing an octave. We simply value liquidity. Good, I said, because I am looking to liquidate about $2 million in cash. Tomorrow. I heard him choke on his own breath. $2 million was $500,000 over his asking price. It was enough to pay off the Russians and still have enough to flee the country in luxury. I had just dangled a lifeline in front of a drowning man. $2 million, Brett whispered. Cash, I repeated. No banks. No mortgage approval waiting periods. A wire transfer within the hour of signing. But I need to see the whites of your eyes, Sterling. I don't do business with voices on a phone. Anytime, Mr. Vanderbilt. Anywhere. The Onyx Room. I said, naming the most pretentious, dimly lit bar in the city. 1 hour. Do not be late. And Sterling. Yes, sir, do not bore me. I hung up. My heart was hammering against my ribs, but my hands were steady. I turned to Tompkins. He took the bait, I said. Tompkins grinned, handing me a leather briefcase. Inside were dummy contracts and a very real, very heavy gold lighter. Go get him, Tiger. 45 minutes later, I walked into the Onyx Room. The place smelled of cedar wood and expensive cologne. It was dark, illuminated only by amber strip lighting under the bar and candles on the tables. It was the perfect environment for a masquerade. I saw Brett immediately. He was sitting in a corner booth, fidgeting with his cufflinks. He had ordered a bottle of champagne, clearly trying to look successful, but his leg was bouncing nervously under the table. I walked over. I did not limp. I forced my bad hip to behave, turning the pain into a rigid military stride. I walked straight up to the table and stood there until he looked up. Mr. Vanderbilt, he asked, half rising. I didn't answer. I just sat down opposite him, keeping my sunglasses on. I threw the heavy leather briefcase onto the table. It landed with a thud that made the champagne glasses rattle. Sit down, I commanded. Brett sat. He looked at me. He looked at my hair. He looked at my suit. He looked at my chin. And he saw a stranger. It was a profound, painful realization. I had lived in the same house as this man for 5 years. We had eaten Thanksgiving dinners together. I had fixed his car. I had mowed his lawn. But he had never really seen me. To him, I was just background noise, furniture, an old man who took up space. His arrogance was my camouflage. He could not recognize me because he had never respected me enough to memorize my face. You are younger than I expected, I lied. And you are? Exactly as I imagined, Sir Brett replied, trying to charm me. A man of presence. I signaled the waiter without looking at him. Scotch, blue label, neat. Leave the bottle. I turned my attention back to Brett. Sell me on this house, Sterling, and do not lie to me. I can smell desperation. Brett took a sip of his drink, his hand trembling slightly. It is a unique opportunity, a classic colonial completely gutted and modernized. Smart home features, heated floors, and the location is prime. What about the previous owner, I asked, taking a sip of the scotch the waiter placed in front of me. The legal report says it was held in a trust. Some old family name. Sullivan Brett's face darkened for a split second, a flash of annoyance crossing his features. Yes. My father-in-law. He resided there for a while. Resided, I pressed, leaning forward. Is he going to be a problem? I do not like complications. I do not like old men showing up on my lawn claiming they own the place. Brett laughed. It was cruel, dismissive laughter. The sound of it made my blood boil, but I kept my face frozen in a mask of bored indifference. Do not worry about him, Mr. Vanderbilt. That situation has been handled. He was difficult. Senile, you know. The dementia was getting bad. He started thinking he was an engineer or something. I gripped the glass of scotch. I was an engineer. I was the engineer. We had to make a tough decision for his own good, Brett continued, leaning in, as if sharing a confidence between two powerful men. I moved him to a facility yesterday. He is gone. The house is clean. Just me and my wife now. And she does what I say. He is gone. Like I was a stray dog he had dropped off at the pound. And the wife, I asked, is she on board? Emily. Brett waved his hand dismissively. She is emotional, but she knows who pays the bills. She will sign whatever I put in front of her. I looked at this man. This little pathetic man who thought he was a king because he could bully a woman and an old man. I wanted to reach across the table and shatter the bottle of Blue Label over his head, but that would be too easy. That would be messy. I didn't want to hurt him. I wanted to obliterate him. Excellent, I said, allowing a thin shark-like smile to touch my lips. I like a man who controls his assets. I opened the briefcase. I pulled out a single sheet of paper. It was a proof of funds statement forged by Gus showing a balance of $50 million in a Swiss account. I slid it across the table. Brett's eyes widened. He practically salivated. I am prepared to make an all-cash offer of $2.5 million, I said. 2.5. Brett choked, but I continued snatching the paper back before he could touch it. I need to inspect the property. Personally. During the open house tomorrow. I want to see this renovation you speak of. I want to see the basement, the foundation. Of course, Brett beamed. For $2.5 million you can inspect the attic dust if you want. I will give you the VIP tour personally. And I want a party, I added, testing his greed. If I buy a house, I want to celebrate immediately. I want your best champagne. I want music. I want a crowd. I want witnesses to my acquisition. Consider it done, Mr. Vanderbilt. It will be the event of the season. I stood up. I buttoned my jacket. I did not offer him my hand. Tomorrow night, Sterling, 7 p.m. Do not disappoint me. I walked out of the bar without looking back. I felt Brett's eyes on me, admiring the suit, admiring the money he thought he was about to get. He had no idea he had just invited his executioner to dinner. I stepped out into the cool night air. Tompkins was waiting in the rental car around the corner. I slid into the passenger seat and pulled off the sunglasses. My hands were finally shaking, not from fear, but from the adrenaline of the hunt. Did he buy it? Tompkins asked. I looked at my reflection in the side mirror. The dye, the suit, the attitude. He bought it all, I whispered. He thinks he cleaned the house of rats. He has no idea he just invited the exterminator back in. Now we just have to wait for the water to rise. The trap is set, and tomorrow Brett Sterling is going to drown in his own greed. The driveway of 42 Oakwood Drive looked more like a showroom for a luxury car dealership than the entrance to a family home. I maneuvered my rented black sedan between a bright yellow Lamborghini and a vintage Porsche, parking intentionally crooked to take up 2 spaces. That is what men like Arthur Vanderbilt did. They took up space because they believed the world owed it to them. I checked my reflection in the rearview mirror one last time. The aviator sunglasses hid my eyes, the jet black hair dye hid my age, and the $5,000 suit hid the pounding heart of a terrified father. I took a deep breath, inhaling the scent of the new leather interior, and stepped out into the night. The music hit me before I even reached the front door. It was a rhythmic, bass-heavy electronic thumping that rattled the window panes I had installed with double glazing to keep the heat in. Now they were vibrating with the sound of excess. The front door was wide open, spilling golden light onto the lawn. Strangers were walking in and out of my house, laughing, drinking, and dropping cigarette ash on the flower beds where Catherine had planted her prize-winning hydrangeas. I felt a surge of nausea, a physical revulsion at the violation of my sanctuary, but I swallowed it down. Tonight, I was not Harold the homeowner. I was Vanderbilt the shark, and sharks do not feel nausea. They smell blood. Brett met me in the foyer. He was wearing a velvet tuxedo jacket that looked ridiculous, sweating profusely despite the cool air conditioning. His eyes were darting around the room, manic and wide. He looked like a man who was holding a grenade with the pin pulled, waiting for someone to take it from him. When he saw me, his face transformed into a mask of obsequious delight. "Mr. Vanderbilt," he practically shouted, extending a hand that was damp with perspiration. "You made it. Welcome to the main event." I ignored his hand. I took off my sunglasses slowly, hooking them into my breast pocket, and looked around the living room with a sneer of calculated, unimpressed boredom. I removed the warmth from my eyes and let the cold, hard logic of an engineer take over. "It is loud." "Sterling," I said, my voice dropping an octave, rough and commanding. "I thought I was buying a home, not a nightclub." Brett's smile faltered for a second, but he recovered quickly. "Just creating an atmosphere, sir. Showing the entertainment potential." "Can I get you a drink, Dom Perignon?" "We have the '96 vintage." I waved his offer away. I walked past him, stepping onto the hardwood floors I had sanded on my hands and knees 30 years ago. The room was filled with people who looked like copies of Brett, young, flashy, and hollow. They were discussing stock options and crypto wallets, oblivious to the fact that they were standing in a house built on love and sacrifice. And then I saw her. The crowd parted near the kitchen island, and my heart stopped dead in my chest. Emily was moving through the throng of people holding a heavy silver tray laden with crystal flutes. She looked thinner than I had ever seen her. Her face was pale, her eyes cast down at the floor as she navigated around the guests, who treated her like invisible furniture. She was not wearing the jewelry I had given her for graduation. She was wearing a simple black dress that looked more like a uniform than a cocktail gown. My daughter. The girl I had carried on my shoulders. The woman who had written that letter to save my life. She was being used as a servant in her own home. I had to clench my fists at my sides to stop myself from rushing over and wrapping her in my arms. I had to remind myself that a hug right now would be a death sentence for both of us. I had to stay in character. I had to be the monster to defeat the monster. As if feeling the weight of my gaze, Emily looked up. Her eyes swept across the room and locked onto mine. Time seemed to warp. The thumping bass faded into a dull hum. I saw the recognition spark in her eyes instantly. A daughter knows her father. She knows the set of his shoulders, the way he holds his head even if his hair is black and his suit is Italian. Her eyes widened. Her mouth opened slightly. The tray in her hands wobbled dangerously. A glass tipped, clinking sharply against the others. Brett turned his head at the sound, his face twisting into a scowl. Careful, he snapped at her, his voice dripping with venom. "Do not embarrass me, Emily." I saw the fear flinch across her face. She was about to say something. She was about to cry out. "Dad." I moved. I did not step forward. I just raised my hand slightly, adjusting my cufflinks, and brought my index finger to my lips for a fraction of a second. A micro gesture. Silence. Emily froze. She saw the signal. She looked from me to Brett, and then back to me. She saw the disguise. She saw the intensity in my stance, and she understood. The terror in her eyes was replaced by a sudden, fierce steel. She steadied the tray. She lowered her head submissively, but I saw her chin lift just a fraction. She gave a tiny, imperceptible nod. "I am sorry, darling," she murmured to Brett, playing her part. "It will not happen again." I turned away, my heart hammering so hard I thought it would crack my ribs. She was safe. For now. She was fighting with me. I turned my attention back to Brett, who was now glaring at his wife with pure contempt. I needed to distract him. I needed to feed his greed so he would not notice the silent conversation that had just happened right under his nose. Sterling, I barked, causing him to jump. "Yes, Mr. Vanderbilt, I am bored," I announced loud enough for the nearby groups to hear. "I came here to do business, not to watch your staff drop glassware." I reached into my inner jacket pocket and pulled out a gold fountain pen and a checkbook. The checkbook was a prop provided by Tompkins, but it looked expensive and heavy. I scanned the room. I saw a few other men in suits eyeing me. One of them, a heavy-set man with a thick neck, was looking at the walls with a critical eye. That had to be an associate of Valkov, or maybe Valkov's appraiser. I had to move fast. I walked to the center of the room near the fireplace. I turned to Brett. "Cut the music," I ordered. Brett blinked. "Excuse me," I said, "cut the damn music." Brett scrambled to a tablet on the wall and swiped a finger. The bass died instantly. The sudden silence was jarring. The guests stopped talking, turning to look at the man in the blue suit who had just hijacked the party. I looked at Brett. I looked at the guests. I looked at the man with the thick neck. "I have seen enough," I declared, my voice booming off the vaulted ceiling. "The layout is adequate. The location suits my portfolio. I do not like wasting time on bidding wars." I opened the checkbook and scribbled on the top page. The sound of the pen on paper was the only noise in the room. I ripped the check out with a flourish and held it up between two fingers. $2.5 million, I said. Cash. Closing tonight. A collective gasp went through the room. I saw Brett's knees actually buckle. He grabbed the back of a sofa to steady himself. His eyes were fixed on that slip of paper like a starving dog looking at a steak. 2.5 million was the magic number. It was salvation. It was freedom. It was more money than he had ever seen in his life. 2.5, he stammered, his voice cracking. "Take it or leave it," I said, stepping closer to him, invading his personal space. "But if you take it, I want everyone out. Now. I want the keys in my hand in 5 minutes, and I want the title deed signed before I finish my drink." Brett looked at the check. He looked at the Russian associate in the corner, who was now frowning and reaching for his phone. Brett knew he had to act before the mobster intervened. "Done!" Brett shouted, almost hysterical. Sold to Mr. Vanderbilt. He reached for the check, his fingers trembling with avarice. I pulled it back at the last second. "Not so fast, Sterling," I said, my voice dropping to a dangerous whisper. Brett froze, his hand suspended in midair. What is it?" "We have a deal." I folded the check and placed it back in my pocket. "I do not buy anything blindly," I said. "I am a man of details. I have seen the cosmetic upgrades. I have seen the pool. But I have not seen the bones." "The bones?" Brett asked, sweat dripping down his forehead. "The foundation," I said. "I want to see the basement." Brett's face went pale. He glanced nervously toward the basement door, which was locked and bolted. The basement. It is just storage, Mr. Vanderbilt. It is unfinished. It is messy. You do not want to go down there. It is dusty." I stepped closer. I could smell the fear on him. It smelled sour. "I am paying $2.5 million for this pile of bricks," I hissed. "If I want to inspect the dust, I will inspect the dust. Unless you are hiding something down there, mold cracks. Or maybe the foundation is rotting away just like your manners." Brett swallowed hard. I could see the wheels turning in his head. He was thinking about the servers. He was thinking about the illegal crypto mining rigs he probably had running down there to try and make back his losses. He was thinking about the mess. But then he looked at my pocket, where the check was waiting. Greed is a powerful blinder. It blinds you to danger. It blinds you to logic. No, no. Nothing like that, he said quickly, forcing a laugh. It is solid as a rock. It is just clutter. But if you insist, I do insist, I said coldly. Brett fumbled in his pocket and pulled out a key ring. Fine. Fine. I will show you the basement. But we have to make it quick. The lawyers are waiting. He turned and walked toward the basement door. I followed him. I looked over my shoulder one last time. Emily was standing by the kitchen, clutching the tray to her chest. Her eyes were wide, filled with a mixture of terror and hope. I gave her a single sharp nod. I was going underground. I was going to the heart of the house. I was going to the place where I had poured the concrete with my own hands. Brett thought he was showing me a storage room. He didn't know he was leading me to the control room of his own destruction. After you, Mr. Sterling, I said, gesturing to the dark stairwell. Brett stepped onto the first step. I followed. The trap was sprung. The wolf was in the pit. Now all I had to do was pull the lever. The air in the basement was 10 degrees cooler than the rest of the house, carrying the damp, earthy scent of concrete and uncirculated air. It was a smell that usually brought me comfort, reminding me of the months I spent pouring the foundation. But tonight, it smelled like neglect. Brett flicked on the single overhead bulb, casting long, dancing shadows against the unfinished walls. He hovered near the bottom of the stairs, his velvet tuxedo shoes looking absurd against the dusty concrete floor. He wrapped his arms around himself, clearly uncomfortable, checking his watch every 5 seconds. He did not want to be here. He wanted to be upstairs, popping champagne and counting his money. This is it, Brett said, his voice echoing slightly in the cavernous space. As you can see, it is dry. Solid. Just like I said. Can we go back up now? The guests are waiting. I ignored him. I walked deeper into the gloom, my Italian leather shoes making a crisp, authoritative sound on the cement. I ran a hand along a support column, checking for cracks that I knew were not there. I needed to get him away from the utility room. I needed 5 minutes alone with the heart of the house. I stopped in the center of the room and looked up at the exposed floor joists. I frowned, letting out a low, disapproving hum. What Brett asked, his anxiety spiking instantly. What is it? I pointed to a dark corner on the far side of the basement near the old coal chute. There is a shadow on that beam, I lied, keeping my voice flat and professional. It looks like dry rot. Or maybe termite damage. If that beam is compromised, the whole living room floor could collapse under the weight of your party guests. Brett's eyes widened. He looked at the ceiling as if it were about to fall on his head. That is impossible, he stammered. We had an inspection. I cut him off. Go check it. Use your phone flashlight. If it is rot, the deal is off. I am not buying a money pit. Brett hesitated, looking at the dark corner with distaste, but the threat of losing $2.5 million was a powerful motivator. He pulled out his phone, turned on the light, and reluctantly shuffled toward the far wall. As soon as his back was turned, I moved. I did not run. Running makes noise. I slipped silently into the utility alcove behind the main furnace. This was the nerve center of the house. It was a tight maze of copper pipes, PVC conduits, and the humming metal beast of the HVAC system. I knew every inch of this space. I had soldered these joints myself. I had mapped the flow of water and gas like the veins in my own body. I reached into the inner pocket of my suit jacket and pulled out the heavy 10-inch pipe wrench I had concealed there. It had been weighing down the left side of my jacket all night, bruising my ribs, but now it felt like Excalibur in my hand. I located the main water intake assembly. It was a complex array of valves and regulators, and there, shining in the dim light, was the new addition Brett's contractors had installed. The feed line for the infinity pool. It was a rush job. I could see the sloppy welds and the cheap plastic fittings. They had bypassed the safety pressure regulator to increase the flow rate, probably to fill the massive pool faster. Idiots, I whispered. I clamped the wrench onto the main distribution valve. This valve controlled the flow of water from the city main into the house's internal system. Normally, it allowed water to flow in at a safe, regulated pressure. But I knew that if I bypassed the reducer and opened the backflow preventer, I could essentially turn the house's plumbing into a high-pressure cannon. But that was not enough. I needed the pressure to build up and then release all at once. I needed a hammer blow. I turned my attention to the sewage outline. I found the butterfly valve that prevented waste from flowing back into the house during a heavy storm. I gripped the wheel. It was rusted stiff. I gritted my teeth, ignoring the shooting pain in my bad hip, and heaved. The metal groaned. A flake of rust fell onto my polished shoe. "Come on," I hissed. With a sickening screech of metal on metal, the valve turned. I locked it in the closed position. Now nothing could leave the house. Every drop of water, every flush of a toilet, every drain from the sinks would have nowhere to go. Then I moved to the pool pump intake. This was the kill shot. I used the wrench to loosen the intake flange just enough. Not enough to leak yet, but enough that when the pressure spike hit, it would blow the seal completely. The water from the city main, combined with the thousands of gallons in the pool, pressing down from above, would find the path of least resistance. And thanks to Brett sealing the garden drainage valve, the path of least resistance was right here. Up through the basement floor drains, up through the toilets, up through the sinks. I had just turned 42 Oakwood Drive into a ticking hydraulic bomb. I was tightening the last bolt when I heard the heavy thud of footsteps on the stairs. Not Brett's frantic shuffling. These were heavy, deliberate steps. I froze. I pressed myself against the warm metal of the furnace. "Mr. Sterling," a deep voice called out. It was a Russian accent, thick and gravelly. My heart hammered against my ribs. It was the bodyguard, the man with the thick neck I had seen upstairs. I heard Brett's voice from the other side of the basement. "Over here, I am just checking a beam." The bodyguard descended fully into the basement. I could hear the leather of his gun holster creak. He was walking toward the utility alcove. He was doing a perimeter sweep. Professionals did that. They checked the exits. They checked the hiding spots. I stopped breathing. I was trapped. The utility alcove was a dead end. If he turned the corner, he would see me holding a wrench standing next to a sabotaged pipe. The game would be over. I would be dead before I hit the floor, and Emily would be left to their mercy. I looked around frantically. There was only one place. Behind the furnace, there was a narrow gap between the metal casing and the brick wall. It was maybe 18 inches wide. When Emily was 6 years old, she used to hide there during hide and seek. She called it her secret cave. I used to pretend I couldn't find her, walking past the furnace loudly while she giggled into her hands. I was not 6 years old. I was a broad-shouldered man of 75. But fear is a powerful lubricant. I sucked in my stomach, turned sideways, and squeezed into the gap. The rough brick scraped my cheek. The hot metal of the furnace burned through my expensive suit jacket. I jammed myself into the darkness, pulling my arms in tight, praying that the shadows were deep enough. The footsteps got closer. I could smell the bodyguard's cologne. It was cheap musk and stale cigarettes. I saw the beam of a flashlight slice through the darkness of the utility room. It swept over the pipes I had just manipulated. It swept over the floor where I had been standing seconds ago. The light stopped on the wrench. I had left the wrench on top of the pump housing. I closed my eyes. Stupid. Stupid old man. The bodyguard grunted. I heard him step closer. He was reaching for the wrench. "Hey!" Brett's voice rang out sharp and annoyed. The bodyguard stopped. "I said it is fine," Brett yelled, walking back toward the center of the room. "The beam is solid. It was just a shadow. Vanderbilt is just trying to scare me to lower the price." Where is he? The bodyguard turned away from the alcove, leaving the wrench untouched. He walked back toward Brett. I did not see him, the Russian grumbled. He must be in the back, Brett said. Mr. Vanderbilt. Are you done? We need to sign. I waited until their footsteps retreated toward the stairs. I counted to 10. My heart was beating so hard, I felt dizzy. I peeled myself out of the gap, ignoring the stinging scrape on my face and the burn on my shoulder. I grabbed the wrench and shoved it back into my pocket. I took one last look at my handiwork. The pressure gauge on the main line was already creeping up. The needle was vibrating. The pipes were beginning to sing a low, ominous note that only an engineer would hear. It sounded like a tea kettle about to boil. 30 minutes, I whispered to the dark tangle of pipes. Just hold together for 30 minutes. I smoothed my hair. I adjusted my tie. I wiped the brick dust off my cheek with my thumb. Then I walked out of the utility room and toward the stairs. I found Brett and the bodyguard waiting at the bottom step. Brett looked relieved to see me. There you are, he exclaimed. Is everything okay? Did you find any issues? I stopped on the bottom step, looking down at him. I let a slow, arrogant smile spread across my face. The foundation is interesting. Sterling, I said, my voice calm and steady. It has a lot of stored energy. Brett blinked, not understanding. Is that... Good, I clapped him on the shoulder as I brushed past him, starting my ascent back to the party. It is explosive, I said. We walked back into the noise and the light of the living room. The party was in full swing again. Emily was still by the kitchen, her eyes tracking me like a radar. I gave her no sign. I couldn't. The Russian bodyguard was watching me now, his eyes suspicious. I walked straight to the coffee table where the contract lay waiting. I uncapped my gold pen. Let's sign, I announced loud enough for the room to hear. I want to own this house before the clock strikes 8. Brett practically ran to the table. He thrust the pen into my hand. Right here, Mr. Vanderbilt. And here, and initial here. I looked at the paper. It was a standard purchase agreement. I was signing a fake name on a legal document. It was fraud. It was a felony. But compared to what I had just done in the basement, this was nothing. I signed Arthur Vanderbilt with a flourish. The ink was dark and permanent. Brett signed his name next to mine. He was shaking with excitement. He thought he had just won the lottery. I handed him the pen. Congratulations, Brett, I said, looking him dead in the eye. You finally got what you deserve. He grinned, oblivious to the double meaning. Thank you, Arthur. You won't regret this. This house is built to last. I checked my watch. 7:20 p.m. The pressure downstairs was building. The water was pushing against the seals. The dragon was awake. I picked up a glass of champagne from a passing tray. A toast, I proposed, raising my glass. To liquid assets. Brett clinked his glass against mine. Cheers. I took a sip. It tasted like victory, and it tasted like revenge. Now all we had to do was wait for the pipes to scream. The crystal chandelier above the dining table chimed softly, vibrating with the unseen energy pulsing through the walls. I stood near the mantel, gripping my glass of champagne, watching Brett Sterling ascend to his self-made throne. He had gathered everyone in the center of the living room, standing on a velvet ottoman so he could look down on his guests. His face was flushed with alcohol and the dizzying high of what he thought was a multi-million-dollar victory. He held the signed contract in one hand and a bottle of Dom Perignon in the other, looking like a conqueror surveying a battlefield he had not bled for. Ladies and gentlemen, he bellowed, slurring slightly. Silence, please, I want to make a toast. The room quieted down. The Russian mobster in the corner stopped whispering to his associate. The young crypto bros lowered their phones. Emily stood frozen by the kitchen door, her hands clasped so tightly her knuckles were white. She looked at me terrified. I gave her a slow, deliberate wink behind my dark glasses. To vision, Brett shouted, raising the bottle. They told me the market was dead. They told me I was over-leveraged. They told me I was crazy to renovate this old dump. But look at us now, sold for $2.5 million, because I am a visionary. Because I am a genius, the crowd cheered. Glasses clinked. Brett took a massive swig from the bottle, foam spilling onto his velvet jacket. He was laughing, a manic, high-pitched sound that grated on my nerves. He was so busy celebrating himself that he didn't hear it. But I heard it. It started as a low, mournful groan deep within the bones of the house. It sounded like a whale calling from the bottom of the ocean. Then came the shudder, a vibration so intense it made the floorboards tremble under my feet. The water hammer effect. The kinetic energy of thousands of gallons of water suddenly hitting a closed valve, rebounding, and finding the path of least resistance. Brett stopped laughing. He looked down at his feet. Did you feel that? Before anyone could answer, the kitchen sink behind Emily exploded. It was not a leak. It was a geyser. A column of black, foul-smelling sludge shot 5 feet into the air, hitting the ceiling with a wet, heavy slap. It was followed instantly by a sound like a gunshot from the powder room down the hall. The toilet seal had blown. What the hell? Brett screamed, dropping the champagne bottle. It shattered on the floor, but the sound was swallowed by the roaring noise of rushing water. Then the floor drains gave way. The pressure from the municipal main combined with the weight of the water from the infinity pool, pressing down on the saturated earth, forced the sewage back up. Thick, dark liquid began to bubble up from the heating vents, spreading across the pristine white rugs like a cancerous ink. The smell hit us a second later. It was the stench of raw sewage, ancient rot, and sulfur. It was the smell of a lie being exposed. "Oh my God," a woman in a silver dress shrieked as the black liquid splashed onto her designer heels. Chaos erupted. It was absolute primal panic. People were scrambling to get away from the vents, slipping on the slick hardwood. A man in a tuxedo went down hard, his face landing in a puddle of muck that was rapidly expanding from the hallway. "Make it stop," Brett yelled at no one in particular, his eyes bulging. "Make it stop." But physics does not listen to screaming men. The pressure was relentless. The pipes in the walls began to rattle violently. I watched with the cold satisfaction of an engineer as a hairline crack appeared in the plaster of the living room wall, the wall Brett had illegally extended to make the room look bigger. He had used cheap drywall and hadn't reinforced the studs. The water pipes running through that wall were vibrating so hard they shattered the joints. Water sprayed out from behind the paint, soaking the drywall instantly. The cheap material turned to mush. With a tearing sound that sounded like a scream, a massive section of the wall collapsed. Dust and wet plaster exploded outward, covering the guests in a gray, muddy paste. And there, revealed in the gaping hole of the ruined wall, was the secret. It was a large steel safe. Not a wall safe, but a commercial-grade floor safe that Brett had cemented into the structure, hiding it behind the illegal renovation. The impact of the collapsing wall had jarred the keypad, loose sparks flying from the electronic lock as the water shorted out the system. The Russian mobster Dmitry Valkov, who had been watching the chaos with stone-cold eyes, suddenly stepped forward. He didn't care about the water. He didn't care about the smell. He was staring at that safe. He knew what was inside. Cold wallets, hard drives, the ledger of everything Brett had stolen. Brett saw the safe exposed. He saw Valkov looking at it. The color drained from his face so fast, he looked like a corpse. His entire world, the lie he had built, the money he thought he had secured, the escape he had planned, was dissolving in a literal flood of excrement. He spun around, his eyes wild, looking for someone to blame. He couldn't blame me. I was Mr. Vanderbilt, the buyer. He couldn't blame the Russians. He couldn't blame himself. His eyes landed on Emily. She was standing by the kitchen island, shielded slightly from the spray, watching the destruction with a look of awe. She wasn't screaming. She wasn't running. She was standing tall. "You!" Brett shrieked. It was a sound not human, a guttural roar of a cornered animal. He pointed a shaking finger at her. "You did this! You tampered with the pipes! You bitch! You ruined me!" He lunged. He didn't run like a man. He moved like a predator. He splashed through the rising sewage, knocking over a waiter. His hands reaching out, fingers curled into claws. He wasn't thinking about the money anymore. He wanted to hurt. He wanted to destroy the only thing he could still reach. Emily didn't move. She was paralyzed by the sudden shift of his violence. Brett reached her. He grabbed her by the throat, his thumbs digging into her windpipe, slamming her backward against the granite countertop. "You ruined everything!" he screamed, spittle flying from his mouth, mixing with the filth raining down from the ceiling. "I will kill you! I will kill you right here!" The guests screamed. The Russians just watched. I dropped my champagne glass. It fell into the muck without breaking. The time for Mr. Vanderbilt was over. The time for the engineer was over. It was time for the father. I moved, not with the stiffness of a 75-year-old, but with the explosive speed of a man who sees his child in the jaws of a wolf. I tore off my sunglasses. I didn't care who saw my eyes now. I wanted him to see them. I wanted him to see the fire of hell before I put him out. I splashed across the room, ignoring the slippery floor, ignoring the stench. Brett had his back to me, choking the life out of my daughter. I reached him in 3 strides. I didn't tap him on the shoulder. I didn't ask him to stop. I grabbed a handful of his velvet collar and the back of his greased hair. I used his own momentum, pivoting on my good leg, and yanked him backward with every ounce of strength I had left in my old body. Brett released Emily, flying backward with a surprised yelp. He crashed into the mess on the floor, sliding 5 feet through the sewage until he hit the legs of the Russian mobster. I stood between him and my daughter, my chest heaving, my fists clenched. "Get up," I growled, my voice low and thunderous, cutting through the screams and the sound of rushing water. "Get up and face a man, you coward." Brett scrambled to his knees, wiping sludge from his eyes. He looked up at me. He squinted. He looked at the black hair, the suit, and then he looked into my eyes. The eyes he had ignored for 5 years. The eyes of the man he called trash. "Harold," he whispered, his voice trembling with disbelief and horror. I took a step forward, looming over him like a collapsing tower. "Hello, son," I said. "I told you the foundation was explosive." The silence that followed my declaration was heavier than the water pressure destroying the walls. Brett stared up at me, his eyes darting frantically from my face to the ruined room around him. The realization hit him in slow motion. The hair dye was running down my temples, stinging my eyes, but I did not blink. The adrenaline of the moment had numbed the ache in my hip, replacing it with the cold, focused clarity of a soldier back on the front lines. "You!" Brett gasped, scrambling backward in the muck like a crab. "You are supposed to be in a home. You are supposed to be gone." I stepped forward, the water splashing around my ankles. "I am home, Brett. I built this floor. I poured this concrete. And now I am taking out the trash." Brett let out a guttural scream, a mixture of terror and humiliation. He lunged at me again, swinging a wild, desperate fist toward my face. He was 30 years younger than me, fueled by cocaine and rage, but he had never fought for anything real in his life. I had. I learned hand-to-hand combat in the jungles of Vietnam 50 years ago, and muscle memory does not forget just because the body gets old. I did not block his punch. I sidestepped it. As his momentum carried him forward, I grabbed his wrist with my left hand and clamped my right hand onto his shoulder. I used his own weight against him, twisting his arm behind his back and driving my knee into the back of his thigh. It was a simple takedown maneuver, efficient and brutal. Brett went down hard. His face slammed into the layer of sewage and plaster dust covering the floor. I pressed my knee into his spine, pinning him there. He thrashed and gargled, spitting filth, but he could not move. "Stay down," I commanded, my voice booming over the sound of the rushing water. The room was frozen. The guests were huddled against the far walls, ruined designer dresses and soaked tuxedos clinging to their bodies. They watched in horror as the wealthy investor Mr. Vanderbilt dismantled their host. I reached up and peeled the wet black wig from my head, tossing it onto Brett's back. I took a handkerchief from my pocket and wiped the makeup from my jawline, revealing the white stubble underneath. I looked at the Russian mobster Dmitry Valkov, who was standing 10 feet away. Valkov had not moved. He was looking at me with a strange expression. It was not fear. It was respect. He recognized a professional when he saw one. "I am not Arthur Vanderbilt," I announced, addressing the room, but keeping my eyes on Valkov. "My name is Harold Sullivan. I am a structural engineer, and I just taught this boy a lesson about fluid dynamics and pressure points." Valkov looked at the gaping hole in the wall where the safe was exposed. Sparks were still flying from the keypad as the water shorted out the electronic lock. He took a step toward it, his hand reaching inside his jacket. "I would not do that," I said calmly. Valkov narrowed his eyes. "You think you can stop me, old man?" I pointed to the front window. "Look outside." Blue and red lights erupted through the darkness, cutting through the rain and illuminating the chaos inside the living room. The wail of sirens, dozens of them, rose above the sound of the dying plumbing. "My friend Gus is very thorough," I said. "He did not just call the local police, he called the FBI." The front door, which was already standing open, was suddenly filled with figures in windbreakers. But these were not beat cops. These were federal agents, guns drawn, moving with tactical precision. And leading them was not a young field commander, but a man in a beige trench coat and slippers. Gus walked into the room, stepping carefully over the puddles. He held a laptop under one arm and a federal warrant in the other. He looked around the devastated room, pushed his glasses up his nose, and smiled. "You made a mess," Harry Gus said dryly. I shrugged. "Demolition is a messy business." The agents swarmed the room. "FBI! Nobody move!" voices shouted. Valkov raised his hands slowly, a look of resignation crossing his face. He knew when he was beaten. He glared at Brett, who was still pinned under my knee. "You brought the feds to my money," Valkov growled at Brett. "You are a dead man." Two agents moved in on Valkov, cuffing him and dragging him away from the safe. Gus walked straight to the hole in the wall. He beckoned a forensic technician over. "Get that safe open," Gus ordered. "The warrant covers all digital and physical assets. We are looking for cold storage cryptocurrency wallets and a ledger linking Red Bear LLC to illegal money laundering." The technician went to work. Within seconds, using a pry bar on the water-damaged hinges, the door of the safe swung open. Inside, stacked in neat rows, were dozens of hard drives and a black notebook that matched the one in my pocket. "Bingo," Gus said. I stood up, pulling my knee off Brett's back. Two agents immediately hauled him up. Brett looked like a monster from a swamp. His velvet suit was ruined, his face was caked in black sludge, and he was weeping openly. He looked around the room, his eyes wild, looking for an escape that did not exist. "It wasn't me," Brett screamed as the cuffs clicked around his wrists. "It was her. It was Emily. She did it. She embezzled the money. I am the victim here." He tried to point at Emily, but the agent jerked his arm back. "Save it for the judge," the agent said. Emily was standing by the kitchen island. She was soaked. Her hair was plastered to her face. She was shaking, but not from cold. She was shaking from the release of 5 years of terror. She looked at Brett, the man who had controlled her, beaten her, and tried to sell her out. The agent began to read Brett his rights. "You have the right to remain silent." Brett ignored him. He lunged toward Emily again, straining against the cuffs. Emily, tell them I am innocent. You owe me this, after everything I gave you. Emily stepped away from the counter. She walked slowly across the ruined floor. The guests parted for her. She walked with her head high, her eyes locked on Brett. She stopped inches from him. Brett stopped screaming. He looked at her thinking he saw hesitation, thinking he could still manipulate her. Baby, please, he whispered. We can fix this. Just tell them. Emily raised her hand. It was not a fast motion. It was deliberate. She brought her palm across his face with a force that echoed through the room like a crack of thunder. It was a slap that carried the weight of every insult, every bruise, and every lie he had ever inflicted on her. Brett's head snapped to the side. A silence fell over the room, deeper than before. Emily leaned in close, her voice steady and cold as ice. You gave me nothing but debt and pain, Brett, she said. She reached into the pocket of her ruined dress and pulled out a single crumpled dollar bill. She tucked it into the breast pocket of his sewage-soaked tuxedo. This is the interest you owe me, she whispered. Keep the change. Brett stared at her, his mouth hanging open, his power completely evaporated. The agents dragged him toward the door. As he passed me, he looked at me one last time. I was cleaning my glasses with the dry corner of my shirt. I told you, son, I said softly. I checked the load-bearing walls, and you were never strong enough to hold this family up. They shoved him into the back of a squad car, the lights flashing against his defeated face. I watched him go, feeling a heavy weight lift off my chest. The house was destroyed. The walls were wet. The floor was ruined. But the rot was gone. Gus walked over to me, clapping a hand on my shoulder. We got the ledger, Harry, he said quietly. And we secured the accounts. The $700,000 is safe. It is legally Emily's money, now proven as separate from his criminal enterprise. I looked at Emily. She was standing in the middle of the wreckage, hugging herself. She looked small, but she was standing on her own 2 feet. I walked over to her. I didn't say a word. I just opened my arms. She collapsed into me, burying her face in my chest, sobbing. But these were not tears of fear. They were tears of relief. I held her tight, resting my chin on her wet hair. I looked around at the destruction of my life's work. The drywall was mush. The floors were warping. The smell was terrible. But the foundation held. It is okay, Em, I whispered. It is just a house. We can build another one. She pulled back and looked at me, her eyes shining. You saved me, Dad. No, I corrected her, wiping a smudge of dirt from her cheek. We saved each other. I just provided the tools. You provided the courage. Tompkins appeared at the doorway holding a bottle of unspilled champagne he had rescued from the kitchen. Well, he said, surveying the damage, the party is over. But I think we have grounds for a very interesting insurance claim. Malicious destruction of property by a previous tenant. I laughed. It hurt my ribs, but it felt good. Let's go, I said to my daughter. Let's get out of here. I know a motel that has terrible coffee but great company. We walked out into the night, leaving the ruin of 42 Oakwood Drive behind us. The rain had stopped. The air was crisp and clean. As we walked down the driveway past the police cars and the gawking neighbors, I did not look down. I did not hide my face. I was Harold Sullivan. I was 75 years old. I was a father. And I was just getting started. The sound of a judge's gavel hitting a wooden block is remarkably similar to the sound of a hammer driving a nail into a stud. It is a sharp, percussive noise that signifies that a job is finished, that a structure is set. 6 weeks after the disastrous open house, I sat in the back row of the federal courthouse and listened to that sound. It rang out with a clarity that cut through the murmurs of the courtroom. Brett Sterling, the man who had called me trash, the man who had turned my home into a prison for my daughter, stood before the bench. He looked smaller than I remembered, without his expensive suits, without his hair gel, and without the arrogant sneer that had defined him for years, he looked like a child wearing a man's clothes. When the judge pronounced the sentence of 20 years in a federal penitentiary for wire fraud, money laundering, and racketeering, Brett did not scream. He did not fight. He simply slumped forward, his forehead touching the defense table. He had finally collapsed under the weight of his own lies. I looked at Emily sitting beside me. She did not cheer. She did not smile. She simply let out a long, slow breath, as if she had been holding it for 5 years. She reached out and squeezed my hand. Her palm was warm. Her grip was strong. The fear that had lived in her eyes for so long was gone, replaced by a quiet, steady resolve. We walked out of the courthouse into the bright afternoon sun, and for the first time in a long time, the air tasted sweet. It tasted like freedom. The legal battle was over, but the work of rebuilding was just beginning. Gus had spent weeks poring over the forensic accounting with the FBI. It turned out that Brett was as sloppy with his crimes as he was with his relationships. He had tried to mix his dirty money with our family assets, hoping to confuse the trail. But Gus was a master. He managed to surgically separate the finances. He proved with absolute mathematical certainty that the $700,000 in the biscuit tin had no connection to the Ponzi scheme. It was money Emily had inherited from her mother's life insurance policy years ago, combined with cash she had secretly saved from her own salary before Brett forced her to quit her job. It was clean. It was hers. And because the house had been signed over to the shell company under duress and fraudulent pretenses, the transaction was voided. The deed reverted to Emily. We got the house back. But when we first walked back inside a week after the trial, it felt like we were walking into a crime scene. The smell of sewage and damp rot was overpowering. The beautiful hardwood floors I had laid down decades ago were warped and buckled, looking like waves on a storm-tossed sea. The drywall in the living room was a mushy, moldy mess. The basement, where I had sabotaged the pipes, was a disaster zone of mud and rusted metal. Most people would have walked away. A real estate agent told us to bulldoze it and sell the lot. He said the water damage was too extensive, that the stigma of the event would kill the resale value. He said it was a teardown. I looked at Emily standing in the middle of the ruined living room. She was kicking a piece of debris with her sneaker. She looked up at the ceiling where a water stain had bloomed like a dark flower. "What do you think, Dad?" she asked. "Is it total garbage?" I walked over to the main load-bearing wall. I took out my pocket knife and peeled back a section of the rotting drywall. I exposed the wooden stud underneath. It was dark, old-growth timber. I had chosen that wood myself in 1980. I pressed the tip of the knife into it. It was hard, solid, unyielding. "The skin is ugly, Emily," I said, turning to her. "But the bones are good. I built this house to survive hurricanes, blizzards, and time. A little water and a little rat like Brett Sterling cannot destroy the structure. It just needs to be stripped down. It needs to be healed." Emily nodded, a small smile touching her lips. "Then let's heal it." "But Dad," "Yes. No more gray." "I hate gray." I laughed. "I hate gray too. The next 6 months were the hardest and best months of my life. We did not hire a general contractor. We did not bring in a crew of strangers. We did it ourselves. Just me and Emily. We put on masks and gloves and tore out every inch of damaged drywall. We ripped up the ruined floorboards. We hauled dumpsters full of debris out to the curb. It was back-breaking work. My hip ached every single day. My hands were covered in blisters. But every time I swung a sledgehammer, I felt like I was exorcising a ghost. Every time we threw a piece of Brett's pretentious renovation into the trash, we were reclaiming our space. We found things we had forgotten. Under the floorboards in the hallway, we found a time capsule Emily had hidden when she was 10. It contained a drawing of a horse, a plastic ring, and a note that said, "I hope the future is happy." We sat on the subfloor and cried over that note, and then we laughed until our sides hurt. We were not just repairing a house. We were repairing our relationship. We talked. We talked about the years of silence. We talked about how Brett had manipulated her, how he had isolated her, and how she had felt too ashamed to come to me. I apologized for not seeing the signs sooner. She apologized for pushing me away. We laid everything out in the open, stripping our emotional walls down to the studs just like we did with the house. By the time autumn arrived, the house was transformed. We did not rebuild it to look like a modern showpiece. We rebuilt it to look like a home. We restored the original layout. We opened up the fireplace. And finally, on a crisp Saturday in October, it was time for the finishing touch. I stood in the center of the living room holding a paint roller. The walls were fresh and clean, primed and waiting. The floor was covered in drop cloths. Emily walked in carrying a gallon of paint. She pried the lid off. The color inside was not the cold, sterile gray that Brett had loved. It was a rich, warm yellow, the color of butter, the color of sunshine. It was the exact shade my wife Catherine had painted the kitchen in our first apartment. We called it sunbeam yellow. "Ready?" Emily asked, dipping her brush into the can. I dipped my roller. "Ready." We started painting. The color went on smooth and bright, covering the white primer. With every stroke, the room seemed to warm up. The cold, corporate atmosphere of the last few years vanished, replaced by a glow that felt like a hug. We worked in silence for a while, just the sound of the rollers and the birds singing outside the open window. The afternoon sun streamed in, mixing with the yellow paint, making the whole room feel like it was made of gold. I stopped and looked at my daughter. She was wearing old overalls, her hair tied up in a messy bun, a smudge of yellow paint on her nose. She looked beautiful. She looked happy. She looked free. She caught me staring and paused. "What is it, Dad? Did I miss a spot?" I shook my head, feeling a lump form in my throat. "Number one," I was just thinking. You know, people always talk about equity in a house. They talk about market value. They talk about square footage. I looked around the room at the solid walls, at the light, at the life we had brought back into this space. But a house is not an asset, Emily. It is a witness. This house saw you take your first steps. It saw you go to prom. It saw you cry. It saw you get hurt. And it saw you fight back. I walked over to her and took the brush from her hand. I set it down on the tray. I took her hands in mine. They were rough from the work, strong and capable. We had to tear it apart to find out what was holding it up, I said softly. Emily squeezed my hands. "We are the foundation, Dad. You and me." I nodded. "That is right. And this foundation is not going anywhere." 6 months ago, I was an old man lying in the mud, clutching a trash bag, thinking my life was over. I thought I had nothing left to offer. I thought the world belonged to the young, the ruthless, and the loud. But I was wrong. The world belongs to those who build. It belongs to those who can weather the storm and come out the other side with a paintbrush in their hand. I looked at the yellow wall. It was imperfect. There were brush strokes visible. It wasn't the smooth, airbrushed finish of a luxury condo. It was better. It was real. A house does not stand because of the paint on the walls or the expensive furniture in the rooms. It does not stand because of the granite countertops or the infinity pools. Those are just decorations. They can be bought and they can be destroyed. A house stands because of what is underneath. It stands on the deep, unseen things. The concrete, the rebar, the calculations made in the dark to ensure it can handle the weight of the world. Family is the same. We try to paint over our problems. We try to renovate our lives to look perfect for the neighbors. We let people like Brett Sterling come in and tell us that our value lies in what we own, not who we are. But when the storm comes And the storm always comes, the paint peels, the decorations fall, and the only thing that matters is the foundation. We had to break everything down to find the truth. We had to endure the flood to wash away the lies. But we are still standing. My daughter is safe. The monster is gone, and the walls are yellow again. I picked up my roller and turned back to the wall. "Come on, Em," I said. "We have one more coat to go, and then I am going to teach you how to bake your mother's apple pie in the new oven." Emily laughed, a bright, clear sound that filled the room. "I am ready when you are, Dad." We kept painting as the sun went down, turning the yellow walls into a deep, comforting amber. Outside, the autumn leaves were falling, preparing for winter. But inside, it was finally, truly spring. And for the first time in years, the house on Oakwood Drive was not just a building. It was a home. It has been exactly 1 year since the night of the flood. Tonight, the house on Oakwood Drive does not smell of sewage or wet drywall. It smells of roasted chicken and cinnamon. The yellow walls glow under the soft light of the lamps Emily and I picked out together. Gus is sitting at the dining room table, arguing with Tompkins about the rules of chess. They come over every Tuesday now. Gus brings the donuts, and Tompkins brings the legal gossip. They are the uncles Emily never had, and the brothers I never knew I needed. Emily walks in from the kitchen, wiping her hands on an apron. She is laughing at something Gus said. She looks different than she did a year ago. The shadows under her eyes are gone. She used a portion of that $700,000 to go back to school. She is studying interior design. She wants to help people make their homes beautiful, but she has a rule: she only works on houses with good bones. She tells her clients, "Fix the foundation first, then we can talk about the curtains." As for me, I am back in the garden. I dug up the concrete slab Brett had poured over the drainage valve. I restored the old iron grate. The water flows freely now, just as it was designed to. I realized that for a long time I was like that valve. I was buried, silenced, and pressurized. But not anymore. I still keep that old metal biscuit tin on my dresser. It is empty now, but I keep it as a reminder. It reminds me that even when the world throws you out like a piece of trash, even when you are lying in the mud in the rain, you still have value. You can still hold a treasure inside. You just have to be brave enough to open the lid and fight for it. Brett sends letters from prison sometimes. We do not open them. We do not read them. We simply toss them into the fireplace on cold nights. They make excellent kindling. We do not hate him anymore. Hate takes too much energy. We simply do not have room for him in our new construction. If you are listening to this story, and you feel like you are trapped in a house that is crumbling, or if someone has made you feel small and worthless, please remember this. You are the engineer of your own life. It is never too late to pick up a wrench and change the pressure. It is never too late to tear down the walls and build something better. Thank you for listening to my story. It means a lot to this old man to know that my voice is being heard. If you enjoyed seeing a bully get what he deserved and a family find its way back to each other, please hit the like button and subscribe to the channel. It really helps. And tell me in the comments below, have you ever had to rebuild your life from scratch? I would love to hear your story. Until next time, check your foundations and hold your head high.